On our episode today, we're going to explore some of the basic neuroanatomy that takes place for early recovery from alcoholism. And this is very important to understand. It has to do with the offsetting forces in the brain of the GABA system and the glutamate system. Now these get disrupted based on drinking, and then how they are not at a baseline just because somebody stopped. It takes time to heal. The technical term for this is called Post Acute Withdrawal Syndrome. So we're going to delve into this topic, and I hope you find this really useful for today. Post Acute Withdrawal Syndrome. Think of the name, post-acute. So this is not acute alcohol withdrawal. Acute alcohol withdrawal is highly dangerous. This is the phase of early recovery beyond detox. I think it's important to know that just offering medical stabilization for people and detox does not seem to work. And that has to do with the amount of time that's necessary for the brain to really heal from alcoholism. And we're going to kind of explore that in terms of the neurotransmitters at play and how this really unfolds. In our country, we used to offer more bulk detox. So people would just go in, they'd receive treatment for maybe 3 days, 5 days. They would get through the woods in terms of basic safety, and they would go on their way. And they were told, well, don't go back to drinking. And if they did go back to drinking, they got kind of shamed or criticized that this was on them. But there's actually some neurological processes that are at play as well, and it's important to understand those. Some of the processes were really determined initially by somebody named George Koob. George Koob is now the director of the NIAAA, which is a large federal funding branch of the National Institute of Health, which focuses specifically on alcoholism. Dr. Koob in the early 80s had very advanced rat models that looked at rats who would become addicted to alcohol, and then once you stopped the alcohol, what would happen to these rats? And they would struggle for a couple months in terms of their healing process and getting back to a baseline. He called it a negative state. We now call it PAWS. And the symptoms of PAWS are really a triad of anxiety, agitation, and insomnia. So for anybody who has struggled with alcoholism, who quit drinking, this may resonate with you in terms of the first couple months where you are not at your baseline. You're not functioning at your peak. A lot of this has to do with the concept of the glutamate hypothesis. So the glutamate is a neurotransmitter in the brain that's an activating neurotransmitter. I call it the gas. So it's kind of like it turns on the system, it can drive the system, it gets things done. The offsetting force is something called GABA. So GABA is the brakes, akin to glutamate being the gas. These things are in balance, and they keep the brain in something we call homeostasis, but they will get disrupted via drinking. So alcohol will increase GABA activity. It's kind of like somebody is riding the brake. So if somebody is regularly drinking alcohol each and every day, they have an overall excess amount of GABA-based activity in their brain. So what does the brain do when this happens? And some of this has to do with the way that we will see somebody experience tolerance from alcohol. They may be able to drink very large quantities of alcohol, and you might not even know. That has to do with adaptation in the brain. So what's really going on? The brain is growing in terms of glutamate production to offset the GABA production. This once again maintains the balance. So what happens when a person in this fashion then quits drinking? Well, now the GABA load is taken off of the brain, and the brain has way too much glutamate, unopposed glutamate. So the most extreme version of this, or the extreme symptom, can be a withdrawal seizure. That's also why for somebody who is drinking very severely, if they abruptly quit, it can be life-threatening, and sometimes they can require emergency medical care. When we look at this curve, I think what's important to know is the first few days are what's most vulnerable for the worst outcomes. So a seizure, delirium, We call that acute withdrawal. But it's important to know that the next couple months are the territory of what we would call post-acute withdrawal. And that has to do with overall excess levels of glutamate in the brain that lead to this triad of, once again, anxiety, agitation, and insomnia. For anybody who is struggling and looking to make changes, it's important to know that early recovery is very vulnerable territory. Just because you are through the woods does not mean your brain has achieved a basic balance and homeostasis. There's different data on this in terms of how long it may take somebody to reach a good baseline. But we seem to notice very marked improvement within the first 3 months, maybe 6 months, with the slowest symptom to come back might be insomnia. So if you are struggling with difficulty sleeping in the first couple months of your alcoholism, that's a very common symptom. So we would recommend that working with your team or any approach to see if you could address it. And also, if you're a loved one of dealing with anybody who has alcoholism, to be very patient with them for the first month or first couple months in their sobriety. They're not yet at their baseline, but they will get there. Thank you for joining us for our video today, focusing on post-acute withdrawal. This is a very common phenomenon that's going on with anybody who's dealing with early sobriety. It's important to be patient, to understand the process going on, and to start to make overall changes and to keep fighting hard for your sobriety and your recovery. I'm Pat Fehling. Thank you.